February 1967, a hillside in Vietnam, near the Marine base at Duc Pho. The heat sits heavy on the grass. A single Marine lies behind a strange machine, one eye pressed to a telescopic sight bolted to the receiver by hand. Down in the valley, so far away he is barely a smudge in the shimmer, a man pushes a bicycle loaded with weapons along a trail 2,500 yards, nearly a mile and a half of open air. The Marine breathes out, holds, and touches off a single round from a weapon that was never meant to do this. One heavy bullet crosses the valley in the time it takes to blink twice. The bicycle folds, the man goes down, and a gun designed for a war that ended half a century before has just made history it was never built for. The weapon on that hillside was not a rifle. It was a machine gun. A crude, heavy, unglamorous machine gun that the Army bought by the crate because it was simple and it was cheap. And yet, that same basic design has now served American soldiers for nearly 100 years, longer than almost any weapon in the entire history of the United States military. This is the story of the gun they call Deuce, the cheap American machine gun that refused to die. To understand why it was built, you have to go back to the mud of the First World War. By 1917, the battlefield had changed. The enemy was putting armor plate on things. Aircraft flew low over the trenches with metal skins that shrugged off ordinary rifle fire. On the ground, the first tanks crawled forward, ugly and slow, but bulletproof to anything the infantry carried. The standard machine gun of the day fired a rifle cartridge, the same round a soldier put in his shoulder weapon. Against a sheet of steel, that round simply spattered and fell away. Think about what that meant for the men in the trenches. A new kind of target was appearing over their heads and rolling toward their lines, and the best weapon they had could not touch it. The American Expeditionary Force in France had a problem, and the man who saw it clearest was its commander, General John J. Pershing. Pershing wanted something bigger. He went to the Ordnance Department and asked for a machine gun of at least half an inch in caliber, throwing a bullet at least 2,700 feet per second. He wanted a gun that could reach up and swat an aircraft out of the sky and punch through the armor of a tank on the ground. Nobody in America had such a weapon sitting on a shelf. So the Army turned to the one man who could almost certainly build it. His name was John Moses Browning. If you have never heard that name, you have still felt his work. Browning designed the pistol the Army carried for 3/4 of a century. He designed the automatic rifle the infantry leaned on in 2 world wars. He designed the machine guns that armed a generation of American soldiers. One author who studied his life estimated that something like 35 to 40 million firearms have been built on patterns Browning drew. As that author put it, Browning was to guns what Thomas Edison was to electricity. When the Army needed the impossible, they went to the man who made the impossible for a living. Browning took his own .30 caliber machine gun and began scaling it up. Bigger receiver, bigger bolt, a heavier spring to tame the recoil of a monster round, and he needed a cartridge to match. Working with the Winchester Company, engineers built essentially a giant version of the standard rifle round, a bullet as long as a man's finger, driven by a case packed with powder. The first big gun was tested on October 15, 1918. It was not ready. It fired too slowly, and the bullet flew too weakly to do what Pershing wanted. And then, less than a month later, on November 11, 1918, the war ended. The gun Pershing asked for arrived just too late to fire a shot in anger. Now, here is a myth worth killing right now, because you will hear it repeated everywhere. People say the American .50 caliber round was simply copied from a captured German anti-tank cartridge. It was not. The American project began before the Allies even knew the German round existed. The German cartridge was looked at, and it did help engineers pick a performance target to beat, but it was rejected as a base. Its case was the wrong shape for smooth automatic feeding. The American round was its own design, and in the end, it was the better one. Remember that, because getting these small details right is the difference between a story you can trust and a story someone made up. So the war was over, but the gun lived on. Browning kept refining it through the 1920s. He died in 1926 before his heavy machine gun reached its final form. Other engineers picked up the work he left behind. They took several different versions of the weapon and folded them into a single receiver, one clever design that could feed its ammunition belt from either the left or the right side, and could be built for aircraft, for ships, for tanks, or for the ground, all from the same core. With the Navy backing the project, the Colt Company began building the finished weapon in 1933. That is the birthday that matters. The gun got its official designation, the M2. And, in its heavy barrel form, it became the shape you would still recognize today, sitting on top of an American vehicle almost a century later. And this is where the paradox really begins. Because the M2 was not clever in the way you might expect. It was not delicate. It was not advanced. It was a deliberately plain, mechanically conservative design, built to be understood by a tired man in the dark. And that was the whole point. Let me give you the numbers, because the numbers are the story. The gun fires a .50 caliber round, a bullet about the length of your hand from wrist to fingertip. The barrel alone is nearly 4 feet long. The whole gun weighs about 84 pounds, and the tripod adds another 44 on top of that, so a full setup weighs as much as a large adult man. It spits out somewhere between 450 and 575 rounds a minute. Each of those rounds leaves the muzzle at around 2,900 feet per second, roughly 3 times the speed of sound. Its effective range is about 1,800 meters, more than a mile. And its bullets can still be lethal out past 7,000 meters. That is over 4 miles. A gun set up on one hilltop could reach a target the naked eye can barely find. There is a reason it hits so hard, and it comes down to that one heavy bullet. A rifle round is built to kill a man. The .50 caliber round is built to kill the thing the man is hiding behind. It goes through walls. It goes through the side of a truck. It goes through the engine block of a light vehicle and out the other side. For the soldier on the receiving end, there is no cover that feels safe, and that fear is a weapon all by itself. And yet, for all that reach and power, the design underneath was old-fashioned, even when it was new. Rival guns had features the M2 lacked for decades. It had no quick way to swap a hot barrel in the field. Changing a barrel meant a fiddly manual procedure of setting the headspace and the timing by hand, turning the barrel a precise amount, and adjusting the gun so it would fire safely. Get it wrong, and the weapon could injure the man operating it. Soldiers were hurt doing it in Iraq and Afghanistan, decades after the flaw was first noticed. The gun also had no real safety catch. Crews famously jammed a spent cartridge case under the trigger to keep it from firing by accident. On paper, next to a modern weapon, it looked like a museum piece. But paper does not win wars. Here is what actually mattered. The M2 never broke. It was so simple and so rugged that a soldier from 1918 could walk up to a modern one and work it without a lesson. It was so cheap that the Army could buy it by the thousand and put it everywhere, on every truck, every ship, every wall. And today, replacing a single one costs the American military about $14,000. For a weapon that can reach out 4 miles and stop a vehicle dead, that is almost nothing. The clone of a modern missile costs more than a house. The M2 costs less than a used car, and it has been earning its keep for 90 years. Quick one. If these stories are your kind of thing, subscribing genuinely helps. Now, back to that hillside. Because a gun this rugged did not stay in one job. It went everywhere. To understand the M2, you have to see the sheer range of places it turned up, and the men who trusted their lives to it. Start in the air. In the Second World War, the M2 was bolted onto almost anything with wings. The American fighter called the P-47 Thunderbolt carried 8 of them, 4 in each wing, fed by 3,400 rounds. It was the heaviest gun battery of any single-engine fighter in the war. 1 second on the trigger sent about 120 bullets tearing into a target. A pilot who lined up an enemy plane and held the trigger for a heartbeat was throwing a wall of lead the size of a garage door. The same gun defended the great bombers, the B-17 and the B-24, where gunners hunched in freezing turrets, sometimes at 40 degrees below zero, hosing 50 caliber fire at enemy fighters closing in at hundreds of miles an hour. When you picture the American air war over Europe, you are picturing the M2. Now come down to the ground, and to a name the soldiers gave one of the strangest versions of the gun. Engineers bolted 4 M2s together onto one powered mount that could spin and tilt. They called it the meat chopper. It was built to shred low-flying aircraft, 4 heavy machine guns firing at once, a storm of metal no plane could survive flying through. But it found a second, more terrible job. In the Korean War, when human wave attacks came out of the dark, waves of Chinese and North Korean infantry advancing behind bugles and whistles, the meat choppers were turned level and aimed at the men. In February of 1951, at a shattered crossroads village called Chipyong-ni, a surrounded American regiment held a tight perimeter against wave after wave of Chinese attackers. Among the defenders were the Quad 50s, the flak wagons, dug in at the roadblocks. When the enemy closed in through the fog before dawn, those guns opened fire at point-blank range and cut the attack apart. One veteran called it the oddest infantry battle he ever saw, fighting from before daybreak until after 4 in the afternoon, non-stop, just blasting away. The regiment held, the line did not break, and the gun designed to shoot down biplanes had helped win one of the greatest defensive stands in American military history. But the M2 is not only a story of machines. It is a story of the men who happened to be standing next to one when everything went wrong. And no story shows that better than the morning that dragged America into the war. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. On the battleship West Virginia, a mess attendant named Doris Miller was collecting laundry when the first torpedoes hit. Miller was a cook. In that Navy, in that era, a black sailor was not trusted with a weapon and was never trained to fire one. He was strong, a ship's boxing champion, but his job was to serve food and clean up. When the attack came, he first helped carry his wounded captain to safety. Then he found an unattended 50 caliber anti-aircraft gun on the deck, a weapon he had never been taught to use, and he did not run. He figured it out on his own, aimed it at the Japanese planes swarming overhead, and fired until the ammunition ran out and he was ordered to abandon ship. For that, Doris Miller became the first African-American sailor awarded the Navy Cross, pinned on him by Admiral Nimitz himself. An untrained cook, an unglamorous gun, and a moment of courage that outlived them both. And then there is the Marine on the hillside, the one this whole story began with. His name was Carlos Hathcock, and he was one of the greatest snipers America ever produced. The enemy called him White Feather for the small white feather he wore in his hat, and they put a bounty on his head. In February of 1967, Hathcock tried something no one was supposed to be able to do. He took an M2, a belt-fed machine gun, and turned it into the longest-reaching rifle on Earth. He fitted a telescopic sight to it with a custom bracket built by hand. He rested it on sandbags. He set the gun to fire a single round at a time. And with standard ammunition, not special match-grade rounds, he killed an enemy soldier at 2,500 yards, nearly a mile and a half. Think about what that distance really means. At that range, the bullet is in the air for several seconds. The shooter has to account for the curve of the earth, for the wind in 3 different valleys, for the slow fall of the bullet over more than a mile. Hathcock's first round hit the man's bicycle. His second hit the man. That shot stood as the longest confirmed sniper kill in the entire world for roughly 35 years, until Canadian snipers with purpose built modern rifles finally beat it in Afghanistan in the year 2002. A machine gun bought for its low price, older than the man firing it, had set a record that stood for a generation. So how does the old American gun stack up against the weapons its enemies and rivals built? Let us be honest about it, because the truth is more interesting than easy flattery. The German army fielded a machine gun called the MG-42, and in its own role, it was superb, maybe the finest of its kind in the war. It fired far faster than the M2, so fast that the individual shots blurred into a single sound like tearing cloth, a noise that terrified the men it was aimed at. Its barrel could be swapped in seconds when it overheated, something the M2 could not do for decades. In every way that a light, fast infantry machine gun should be good, the MG-42 was better, but it fired a small rifle round. It could not reach as far. It could not punch through armor or an engine block or a brick wall the way the .50 caliber could. It was built for a different job, killing men in the open, and at that job it was frightening. It simply could not do what the M2 did. The Soviets built the closest true rival, a heavy machine gun of almost the same size and power, firing a round nearly identical in punch. It was lighter than the M2, and it was easier to maintain, with none of the finicky headspace and timing trouble. In some ways, it was the more sensible design. But even it could not match the sheer reach of the American gun, and it never spread across the world the way the M2 did. Each of these weapons was excellent. Each was feared. But there is one thing none of them can claim. None of them is still standing on the front line today. The M2 is. Because that is the final remarkable fact of this story. The M2 never retired. It served in Korea. It served in Vietnam. It served in the Gulf War on the tops of Humvees racing across the desert. And in Iraq and Afghanistan, it fought a new kind of war, on roads seeded with hidden bombs and lined with snipers. In those wars, a hard truth became clear. The gunner standing up in the turret, manning the M2 with his head and shoulders exposed, was the most vulnerable man in the convoy. In the first Gulf War, as one soldier put it, they were totally exposed, riding on top with nothing but a flak vest. So the army did something clever. Instead of replacing the 90-year-old gun, they kept it, and they took the man out of the line of fire. They mounted the M2 on a remote-controlled station on the vehicle's roof with cameras and a screen and a joystick inside the armored hull. Now a soldier could aim and fire that same heavy gun with better accuracy than ever, while sitting safe behind steel. The soldiers loved it. The weapon on top was still the same Browning design from 1933. Only the world around it had changed. The Army finally modernized the gun itself, too. A new version fixed the old dangers, adding a barrel that swapped safely in seconds, and at long last, a real safety. They fielded thousands of them, and named it one of the Army's greatest inventions of its year. The Doughboy's gun had been dragged into the 21st century, and it fit right in. And today, it is fighting again. In the war in Ukraine, soldiers mount the very same basic gun on the backs of pickup trucks and send them racing into the night to hunt enemy drones, shooting the small, buzzing robots out of the sky with a weapon designed to kill the biplanes of 1918. A gun built to stop the first primitive aircraft is now stopping the newest ones. The enemy has started flying its drones higher and faster to escape the Browning's reach, which tells you everything. After 100 years, they are still trying to get away from it. There is a myth that a certain German air marshal once said that if his Air Force had owned the American .50 caliber, the Battle of Britain might have ended differently. There is no solid proof he ever said it, so we will leave it where it belongs, as legend, not fact. But the fact that the legend exists at all, that people wanted to believe it, tells you exactly how much that gun was feared by the men who had to face it. So let us go back to the hillside near Duke Foe. One last time. One Marine. One old machine gun with a scope fitted on by hand. One impossible shot across a shimmering valley. That gun was cheap. That gun was crude. That gun was already older than the man firing it and older than his father. And it made history anyway. The most powerful weapon on a battlefield is not always the newest or the most expensive or the one with the cleverest design. Sometimes it is the plain, honest, unglamorous tool that simply works every time in the mud and the cold and the dark for 100 years and simply refuses to quit. They called it Deuce, and a full century after it was born, the old gun is still talking.